For me, part of go where you're treated best means minimizing your risk and understanding what's going to come in the years ahead. And today, I'm going to give you my thoughts for planning ahead for the next 100 years. Obviously, very few, if any of us, will be here 100 years from now. I may not be here next year. I may not make it, honestly. But if I'm looking to plan for the future generations, what do I want my legacy to be? Not only for the rest of my life, but for the next generation and the generation after that. I'm going to have to ask myself some questions, and I'm going to walk you through the things that I believe may change, as well as some things that I wouldn't necessarily be planning ahead 100 years for, and how I would handle that to make sure I still have protection from the world-changing black swan events, etc. I'm Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We help high and ultra-high net worth individuals for the last 10 years, over 1,000 of them, who wanted to legally reduce their taxes by going offshore, increase their freedom by getting dual citizenship, and grow their opportunities by taking advantage of all the world has to offer. There's a lot of countries out there that are growing right now, for example, and so that's one of the things that I would ask myself if I'm planning for the next 100 years. Where is the world going to be? None of us has a crystal ball, but we can analyze based on where world economies is going. And you see economies like the United States, which will certainly be very significant for years to come. You've had people for 50 years who have said that the dollar is going to crash, and no doubt it is worth substantially less than it was 50 years ago. But yet the United States is still there. It's the cleanest shirt in the dirty closet, as they say. And so I'm not writing the United States off entirely. I just may say, I don't want to live there. The taxes are going to be too high. The culture towards wealthy people is going to be too high. They're going to have more regulations, more wealth redistribution, and they're going to do that on an extraterritorial level better than anybody else. And so being a U.S. citizen, being a U.S. resident may be things that I don't want to look for. But does that mean I'll never invest in the United States? No. It means you might have the U.S. as part of your portfolio, but you're also going to figure out what other economies are going to take over, because there are countries right now, like Spain, that are in the top 10 or top 15 largest economies in the world. And they're basically there by default. And so you want to look at things like where are the large population centers and how will that drive their growth. Indonesia is a country very few people talk about. It's got one of the fourth or fifth largest population of any country on earth. They are growing. They are moving. Their equity markets have done better for me in the last year or two than Western markets. And so they're doing a lot of things that are good. There are certainly some risks, as there are in any country, but their risks are different. And so you have markets such as in Southeast Asia, that are more uncorrelated to Western economies, especially frontier markets that are just consistently growing. Countries like Cambodia, to some lesser extent Vietnam. You've got countries that are very mineral dependent, like a Mongolia, which maybe that comes into play. But ask yourself, what economies will take over, either by population, either by natural resources. What are the natural resources of the future? If you believe it's oil, if you believe it's going to be, certain things that go into electric car batteries, what are the resources that we need 100 years from now? Where's the puck going, as they say? And so what economies are going to be the largest based on human capital, based on resources, based on proximity? You're seeing a lot of markets in Asia being developed by having Chinese money come in. You're seeing, South America come together more as a continent. You're seeing Africa, developing, and people say, oh, the latter half of the 21st century will belong to Africa. And so which economies will be largest? Which economies will be fastest growing? Where will the money be safest? Where can I put my money? What kind of money do I want to hold? Whether I believe that's Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, whether I believe that's gold or silver, whether I believe that's some kind of other metal, whether I believe that's Swiss francs, whether I believe in the dollar milkshake and that's the dollar, what money will be safest and where will that money be safest? I would certainly suggest, as we have for years, if I'm going to hold gold, I don't want that all to be physically in one place. And I certainly don't want it to be in a bank, and I certainly don't want it to be in paper form. I want it to be something that I can go and take. And so you can decide what it's going to be. What countries will do. Look at the Western world. Look at the playbook that countries do when they're backed up against the wall. Look at what bullies do. You don't think that Western countries are going to start taxing you more, making your life more difficult, making you fill out more forms, making you, give over control of your retirement account to them, or put your retirement account into certain assets? What are countries that are on decline going to do? Look at where I'm from, in the United States. People are scared, and I'm not saying they're wrong to be scared, but they're scared because you have other countries in this world that are growing. And the average person looks at the world economy as a zero-sum game, and they say, if other people are winning, we're going to be losing. We want our wages to rise every year. We want to have 4 cars. We want 7 TVs. And the fact that the world's not working that way anymore, folks in the Western world are increasingly frustrated. And you're seeing that with what some of the political movements are talking about. Everything should be free, for example. You are going to be very much out of vogue in the Western world. And so what are countries going to do when, just like their own people, they feel that their backs are up against the wall? I certainly have more sympathy for the people than for the governments, but we have to realize we are in a knowledge economy, and just because you're born in the United States, just because you're born in Germany, just because you're born in Australia will not give you the advantage it once did. It already doesn't, and it will only get worse. And so what are countries going to do to respond to that? That's why dual citizenship is important. And so when you put all these factors together, we help people here at Nomad Capitalist create and execute holistic plans to figure out what residence you want, what citizenship you want, what bank accounts you want. These are probably all going to be in different countries, and so you have to plan on a multi-jurisdictional basis. That's where we come in with our network of experts from all around the world, lawyers, accountants, and our own in-house team. We help people figure that out. And so those are the questions I want to ask myself for where the world's going to be along the trajectory of the next 100 years. I take a long-term view. The benefit for me of having lived overseas, basically doing all the things that I believe are risk reduction, having a cash flow business, lowering cost of living, which is less important when you start building a pretty big business, but still is good discipline, having dramatically lower taxes than you would if you lived in your home country, and then reinvesting that money in a globally diversified portfolio. What happens is you can afford to be very long-term minded. Right? When you've got a business where you can barely meet payroll because you hire expensive people in one country and you sell to people in the same country, and the economy gets a little tighter and the recession looks like it's coming, you're going to have a harder time than someone like myself who sells people all over the world. There's always a bull market somewhere. We hire in places where it's most efficient from a tax basis, from a cost basis. We pay people in those countries more than they would make almost anywhere else, but it's still more affordable than hiring, let's say, in the United States or Germany or Australia. And so I can afford to be very long-term minded and think about where I'm going to be in 100 years, because I'm not figuring out, hey, how am I going to be running my business in 1 year? How am I going to be investing my money in 1 year? When I lived in the United States and I helped a friend of mine with a financial services company, we saw people who would come in and they made it to 50 years old. They didn't have that much money to their name. If you follow the Nomad Capitalist approach, you will, by the time you're 50, have millions and tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars, because you'll have the compounding effect of not giving half of it to the government and not basically having water seek its own level by paying the high cost of living, and now you have high inflation in your country. So living overseas helps you keep more money, which allows you to think long term. People say, well, when I move overseas, how do I know where to go? And this is where I don't want to plan for the next 100 years. Our friend George Gammon and I were talking about this at Nomad Capitalist Live, which is our annual event, and he said, there's no place in the world that I would suggest committing to long term as a place to live, basically. But Colombia, which is where he spends most of his time, is a very nice place to spend some time and diversify politically to maximize freedom. Now, what he's mentioning is if you live in Colombia, you can live there less than half the year, you won't have Colombian tax obligations. So they're more flexible than other high tax countries in that regard, let's say than Germany, in terms of staying out of the tax net. And there's a lot of soft freedom in a country like Colombia. You won't know that until you go there and get left alone. Certainly it is not quite as safe as some other places, let's say the UAE or parts of Eastern Europe. So the Eastern Europe, the Gulf, parts of Southeast Asia are going to be safer on both a violent crime and property crime basis. But if you follow basic precautions, you can live in Colombia and you'll be fine. You'll enjoy more soft freedom. You'll enjoy better weather. You'll enjoy better culture. You'll enjoy, as George talks about, better social opportunities, especially if you're single. And so that will work for now. What I would focus on is, where do you store your money? It's more of a long-term decision. Now, that can certainly change. I had a bank account in Liechtenstein. It didn't work for me, so I got rid of it. The fact that Liechtenstein gets very high remarks by everybody doesn't really matter to me. It just didn't work for me. Yet, I do bank and store assets in Singapore, and I think Singapore is one of the best places in the world for someone who is a self-made person, who's not looking for pomp and circumstance, and just wants a reasonable cost, excellent management of their cash in some of the safest banks in the world. I think Singapore is one of the places to go to. I'm going to make a longer-term decision on a place like Singapore, because I don't want to be moving my gold every 6 months. I don't want to be opening new bank accounts every 6 months. Now, I am going to say, listen, I'm going to have bank accounts in different places, what I call tunnels. And so if something happened in Singapore, I have an account in, let's say, Georgia, the country of Georgia. Do I really want to keep all the money I have in Singapore and account in Georgia? No. But I'm going to move that money, if this were to happen, from myself to myself. So I've got relatively low risk from the bank's perspective. And then I can figure out where I want to move that money. So by having different banks around the world, when something happens in one country, I can move money to the other. Obviously, my goal is not to do that, which is why I keep more money in Singapore than I do in Georgia. Not because I don't like Georgia, it serves a role, but the role is not where do you store the majority of your wealth. From a tax point of view, from a stability point of view, from anything. But I think Georgia plays some role. So if you have this diversification, you can afford to basically plan for the next 100 years without making all the fixed decisions. On the things that are more what I would call infrastructure, I'm thinking longer term. So if I'm investing in equities, is Indonesia the play for the next 100 years? Maybe, maybe not. But I think it will play a substantially outsized role. I'm invested in Indonesia, and I can afford to say, I'm just going to let that sit there. I'm 38 years old. 50 years from now, I think Indonesia will be substantially more important, and you will look back on, maybe not every single one of the countries we talk about, but you'll look back on some of them and say, oh, I wish I could get into that. I think that there's a substantial demographics play that country will be more important. I think that there's a substantial play that Singapore wants to maintain its wealth haven status. When I invest in Cambodia, is that going to be something for the next 100 years? Maybe, because it's a frontier market. That also may be an opportunity to make some money in the next decade and cash out 5 times wealthier on that money. I'm not saying that's what it'll do. Obviously, you should do your own due diligence on any investments. But you can have different things, right? So for me, Cambodia is not infrastructure. Certain stock investments are not, maybe infrastructure. Where you store your money in the actual apparatus, whether it's a gold vault, whether it's a box where you put your ledger for your Bitcoin, whether it's an actual bank, that to me is more infrastructure. What citizenships I want, right? Do I want to be a citizen of a country that leaves people alone if they don't live there? That's going to be valuable in coming years. Do I want to be a citizen, or at least a resident, and then become a citizen of a country that is far away from the chaos in the Northern Hemisphere? Yeah. New Zealand is often talked about. I think Uruguay could be a good one. You could make a case for a place like Mauritius, for example. Those are places where it may not be a bad idea to buy property. You can get very favorable tax status, and if you want to live there, you could work towards citizenship. Those are things that I think 100 years from now will be more valuable. If Africa does well, being a citizen of a very benign, non-threatening country in the African Union may be a conduit to making certain investments in countries that won't be opening up as quickly as you would hope. And so you can have some kind of advantage there. These are the kinds of things I'm asking myself. Africa is going to be much bigger population, bigger share of the world economy in 100 years. What are the things that I can do to get access to that? Having a citizenship might mean I'm eligible for more opportunities in the region, again, if certain regional blocks develop. And yet, what George is saying is, commit to living in Colombia. If you live there for 5 years, you can get citizenship, you can learn Spanish. Learning a language wouldn't be a bad thing to do. Teaching your kids, teaching their kids a language wouldn't be a bad thing to do to protect yourself. But I saw a quote from Louis L'Amour. He is an American novelist, and he said, when you think you're done, that's when it begins. And I think that spoke very much to what I and George and I were talking about, where I will live in Malaysia for the time being. I think Malaysia, well positioned in Southeast Asia, growing region, interesting place, tax friendliness. They know where their bread is buttered. Colombia, place for freedom, place to enjoy life. You don't want to necessarily plan where you're going to live for the rest of your life. You're planning the infrastructure. You're planning what citizenships do I need. You're planning where do I want a residence? Where do I want a bank account? Those things are going to be harder, by the way. Right? A country that makes citizenship relatively accessible now, once they become Singapore, is not going to offer citizenship. They're just not going to do it. And so I'm going to understand, I want a Caribbean citizenship, or I want Malta citizenship, or I want to go to Uruguay and work towards citizenship, or Mauritius and work towards citizenship, because those are going to give me access to future investments. Right? I had a friend who became a citizen of an Asian country explicitly, even though the passport's not very good. Now he has access to all the investments in that country, and now he can buy stuff. And what happens if 20 years from now they open up and say, all right, fine, everybody can come and buy stuff? Prices will go way up in a country that's already developing very quickly. That's the kind of stuff where I'm thinking about 100 years. But yet, people say, well, what if you move to Colombia and it doesn't work out? Well, then you go somewhere else. The name of the game is diversification. And so your ancestors perhaps left a country that they weren't happy in. They didn't feel free. Their taxes were too high. They were repressed in some way. They went where they were treated best. Except back then, they had to get in a boat and they had to cross an ocean. And it took them weeks or months. And that was the best they could do. Even in the late 90s, I've told the story before about how my parents debated, should we move from the United States to some other country? And the goal was to move everything from the US to the new country rather than diversify. But today we have the internet. Today we have, every bank has a mobile app. Today you can transact in gold, you can transact in Bitcoin, you can transact in equities all around the world with the touch of a button. You can get citizenships in countries in the Caribbean and elsewhere without ever going to the country. You can do that all through correspondence. And people will do a due diligence check on you without ever meeting you by just checking the records that are easily available to them, often from online sources. So the world has changed. And so if your ancestors had the ability to build a business on the internet rather than a business as a blacksmith, they would perhaps be living in different places. Of course, we also have air travel that allows you to go between different places, to where you can spend part of your year in Uruguay, take advantage of their 10-year tax exemption, take advantage of working towards citizenship, but then also spend part of your time in Asia scouting out investment opportunities and figuring out what's going to happen next. Having a base in a place like Malaysia, and then maybe you go every once in a while to India to check out, hey, where should I be investing in India or Indonesia, what have you. And so the idea that you're going to live in one place for the next 100 years is faulty, because if people had the opportunity to do that 100, 200, 500 years ago, they would have been doing it this way, perhaps. Yes, people are creatures of habit. People like to stay in one place, but people are inherently seeking opportunity, and so is their capital. It's looking to go where it's treated the best. And so the idea of taking what Colombia has to offer, or taking what Malaysia has to offer, or what Georgia has to offer, enjoying it for what it is, contributing to their economy how you can, but not making it the be-all and end-all. Whether you want to live in one place now and say, hey, if in 3 years I don't like it, or if the conditions get worse, or if they change the tax laws, I'm going to move and here's my next place in line, or whether you want to do as I do and have a couple different places around the world that you seamlessly move between. When the pandemic was really impacting Asia, it was the first year on record in the last decade I did not spend any time in Asia. I adapted. Did that mean that I don't believe in Asia? No. If for some reason something happened that I could no longer believe in Asia, then I would have 5 other options around the world. And so that's what George and I were really talking about. You can't be planning for the next 3 centuries where you're going to live, because that was never part of the deal to begin with. People throughout history would have chosen to diversify had that been an option, but it wasn't. Now it is. And so you've got to get past your home country's brokerage accounts and your home country's banks to be able to hold different currencies, hold different countries' equities, hold property in other countries, move your gold somewhere else. You can do all these things all entirely online. We help our clients do it all the time. We work and we create multi-jurisdictional plans for folks, and then we execute it because we have hundreds of folks around the world that we trust who can help us do all that. Don't just pick one country. Pick which country serves you best for each need. And for living, we are, as human beings, emerging creatures. When I first went overseas, I had just sold all my businesses in the US, and Nomad Capitalist was a blog. Now Nomad Capitalist is a multi-8-figure business, and we have employees around the world, and so my needs are going to naturally change. The idea that, I should just never grow a business, right? 5 years from now, if the business is a 9-figure business, for example, the needs are going to be different. And so maybe that'll happen and maybe it won't, but I want to be prepared. What happens if I have a 9-figure business? What happens if this? What happens if that? That's how you plan for the next 100 years. And so the idea that planning for the next 100 years means pick one country that's never going to change is a faulty assumption, because you're arbitraging between different countries. You're spending time there as much as you want or as little as you want. You're working towards residence and citizenship. You're growing your portfolio of passports and opportunities that you have access to. More options means more flexibility, means you're more in control. But are you moving your family to Colombia for the rest of your life? No. And in fact, I don't think your family, they would benefit from speaking different language, living in different places, and seeing different opportunities. And again, you can get tutors. They can travel with you. You can homeschool. I mean, it's never been easier with the right passport to travel the world. You can, worst case scenario, hire a tutor and get them a passport, or add them to your residence permit. I mean, there's so many ways to do this stuff. So yes, plan for the next 100 years, but don't delude yourself into thinking that you're trying to find one country to live. It's never going to change.